who would and would not be allowed to give birth was not a new one. In 1934, Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger had proposed that the U.S. government implement a system in which women would not have the legal right to have a child without a permit from the government, and that these permits would only be good for one baby.
But eventually, proposals like forced sterilization, chemicals in the food and water supply, and government control of childbearing were abandoned by most people in the eugenics movement. Despite the fact that many of them openly advocated such ideas, they would come to realize that there was really no practical way to carry them out. But for all their failures, what the eugenics movement had accomplished was to lay the foundation for the next phase of their plan. And this is where they would find the success that they had been chasing for over 100 years.
The final solution.
What would you say is now the #1 cause of death in the African American community?
Heart disease.
Oh, HIV/AIDS.
Diabetes, cancer, AIDS.
I'll say heart disease. AIDS.
From what I heard, it's probably AIDS, you know.
Probably heart disease. I think heart disease.
Abortion.
HIV. Gang violence.
What if I told you the real answer was abortion?
Since 1973, legal abortion has killed more African Americans than AIDS, cancer, diabetes, heart disease, and violent crime combined. Every week, more blacks die in American abortion clinics than were killed in the entire Vietnam War. And the largest chain of abortion clinics in the United States is operated by Planned Parenthood.
Now, as some of you who were paying close attention have heard, they on record planned to put chemicals in the food and water, and then they decided that this wasn't practical. How could they do it? Let me fill in some blanks here that this documentary doesn't cover for whatever reason. Then Big Pharma steps in, the most profitable industry, knowing that people will flush their pills down the water, and then GMOs and Rockefeller steps in. Yes, these things have to do with eugenics. Don't let it come to another dramatic case such as Lily's before you acknowledge that I am correct.
They were saying that feeble-mindedness is hereditary. So they sterilized me so I would not produce my kind. Mind you, I am not illiterate, nor am I feeble-minded. I never went into high school, but yet I still acquired a college degree. They also justified that my child or my children would be feeble-minded. My son is the president of his own semiconductor company. He has his own construction company.
You fucking eugenicists were wrong, and you're still fucking wrong. Why don't you get it?
File on every child whose name reached her desk so that they could be picked up as soon as they reached childbearing age. Casebolt was still on the board in 1968 when it approved the sterilization of 14-year-old Elaine Riddick.
It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Oliver Wendell Holmes, U.S. Supreme Court Justice, 1927.
Holmes made this statement in his ruling on the constitutionality of Virginia's forced sterilization law. It mirrored the views of President Theodore Roosevelt, who had originally appointed Holmes to the Supreme Court. In a 1913 letter to American Eugenics Society founder Charles Davenport, Roosevelt had stated that the country had no business allowing citizens of the wrong type to reproduce. Letter to American Eugenics Society founder Charles Davenport, Roosevelt had stated that the country had no business allowing citizens of the wrong type to reproduce.
Listen carefully.
In 1907, Indiana had become the first of more than 30 states to pass sterilization laws, and some of those laws stayed on the books well into the 1970s. In fact, the state of Oregon did its last sterilization in 1981 and did not abolish its eugenics board until October of 1983.
Some states practice sterilization without ever creating an official eugenics board. In those instances, few if any records were kept. And in the states that did keep records, many have never been made available to the public. But in just those states that have released their records, it is known that at least 60,000 Americans were sterilized, and they were disproportionately black. In addition...
Wake up, people. Don't you see what's going on here? Don't you see? Well, some of these states didn't even release their records to the public. Okay? This is still going on.
But in just those states that have released their records, it is known that at least 60,000 Americans were sterilized, and they were disproportionately black. In addition, during a 1973 lawsuit, a federal judge estimated that as many as 150,000 additional low-income women may have been sterilized under federal programs alone. These sterilizations were often performed without the patient's knowledge or consent, and sometimes against their will. It was also common for social workers to tell welfare recipients that they would lose their benefits if they did not agree to be sterilized.
Don't you see what is going on here? Same thing psychiatry does. Now I'm about to play you a clip that proves that this is still going on all over the world. And bear in mind that this clip is just the people who were caught in the past few years or so. Pay attention now, and pay attention to who they are. And if who they are doesn't disgust you as much as it does me, you may as well stop listening because you're a devil. These are the people who were supposedly the biggest victims of eugenics in World War II, doing eugenics. The coalition, the unholy alliance between whites, who are racist, eugenicists, just like Hitler was, and these people. I found many reports, valid sources. RT, I like RT, so I'm going to play this. Notice that she brings up cultural norms. And I'm telling you, people, the danger of white and, satanic Jewish social norms, goes beyond just them denying me, my credit and trying to force medicate me. I mean, that is horrible enough as it is. But listen carefully.
I want to talk to you about something that used to be a very prominent practice right here in the United States: eugenics. Eugenics is a movement of people that think human populations can be improved through selective breeding and forced sterilization. Proponents of the practice actually believe that their social status is due to their superior genetic makeup. Shockingly, eugenics played a significant role in the cultural development of many institutions in the U.S. and was a widely accepted cultural norm. In fact, a 1937 Fortune magazine poll found that only 15% of Americans opposed the practice. Actually, the U.S. pioneered the sterilization movement against defective genetic traits, which then paved the way for Hitler's widespread genocidal practice of eugenics against minorities in Germany. Even though the Nazi Party considered the U.S. an ally in the eugenics movement, World War II greatly changed the American perception of the inhumane practice. But before it was finally condemned in the U.S., it affected an estimated 65,000 Native American, African American, and disabled women who had all been forcibly sterilized. Soon after, the anti-eugenics sentiment spread worldwide and was considered a violation of human rights in almost every international body, which now say that perpetrators of this practice should be punished and the victims compensated. In fact, according to the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, one of the factors listed as an act of genocide is the intent to destroy a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as, quote, imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Fast forward to today. What would you say if I told you that eugenics is still in full effect, and even worse, that it's being administered by a first world democracy? Yep, believe it or not, the Israeli government has been forcibly administering birth control to a segment of its population. For the first time, an Israeli government official has publicly acknowledged their practice of injecting Ethiopian Jewish women against their will with contraceptives. Israel is a country that has experienced a significant influx of Ethiopian immigrants during the last 2 decades. Now, some 130,000 Ethiopians, most of whom are Jewish, live in the country. However, the Ethiopian minority population is heavily marginalized and segregated. Not to mention they experience exponentially higher poverty and unemployment rates than that of native Israelis. In fact, there have been multiple instances of racist mobs who have vandalized and harassed Ethiopian neighborhoods. And even these nationalists are even supported by some members of the Israeli Knesset. At one nationalist rally, a Knesset minister, Miri Regev, described illegal immigrants as a, quote, cancer to the country. But these instances of racism have long plagued Israel. Back in 1996, thousands of Ethiopian Jews clashed with riot police over the news that blood they donated was secretly dumped out because of fear that it was contaminated with AIDS. But perhaps more disturbing than all of this is that the Ethiopian Jewish population has been struggling with a staggering 50% decline in their birth rate over the last decade. And this week, we've finally been able to confirm why. According to Israel news source Haaretz, the government has been injecting Ethiopian Jewish immigrants with Depo-Provera, a hormonal contraceptive, and they've been doing it without their consent or knowledge. One investigative journalist who interviewed 35 Ethiopian immigrants found that they were intimidated and threatened into taking the shots, which they were told were merely inoculations. Not only is this completely inhumane and despicable, it's also a complete violation of human rights and female sovereignty and making their own reproductive choices. But even though they have now admitted to the practice, they have denied wrongdoing. In light of this scandal, Israel's health minister now claims that gynecologists have been ordered, quote, not to renew prescriptions for Depo-Provera for women of Ethiopian origin if for any reason there's concern that they might not understand the ramifications of the treatment. Great. But what about the compensation for the victims? What about the accountability for the perpetrators? Sorry, but the Israeli government's word just doesn't cut it when they already act with complete impunity. The part that really irks me, though, is the utter hypocrisy. Israel is the only country in the world that was paved for a specific group of people that experienced such horrific discrimination and genocide. And for that same group of people to now use Hitler's methods against another minority to maintain a Jewish majority is insane. I guess it's true when they say history repeats itself.
Now keep in mind that the same arguments that psychiatry is making, it's the same arguments the eugenicists are making. Hereditary traits that call for forced chemicals, chemicals forced on the quote-unquote patient, okay? Now, also, when you're in the psych ward, everyone knows that if you want quote-unquote stabilized on your medication, they will have a hearing and they will force medicate you. And that process needs to take place in order for you to be discharged.
Meanwhile, another state proposed jail time for anyone who had a child out of wedlock unless they agreed to be sterilized, and at least one state requires sterilization as a condition of being released from custody.
Now, also bear in mind, as I pointed out earlier, in part one or earlier in this part, that, Lily, well, it was part one, Lily, was denied a chance to be on the list, to get a heart because she was developmentally disabled right here in California. Okay? Now, I have proven definitively that psychiatric medications cause birth defects. Okay? Now you put one and one together. A patient of psychiatry, if they have a baby, there's a chance that baby will have birth defects, including bad heart, and perhaps be developmentally challenged. And if they need a heart, they are denied. Thus, eugenics is fed by psychiatry. Way number 2036. I'm just throwing a number out there so you can understand how there are different ways this plays in. And notice they're also concerned with the legality of it and whether or not it is unconstitutional. So they're making it popular or common for things that are unconstitutional, like the surveillance state and forced medication and stifling dissent, to be allowed.
These laws were not producing the results Planned Parenthood and others in the eugenics movement wanted. They also began to fear that federal courts were going to eventually rule that these kinds of measures were unconstitutional. At about the same time, however, something new was being introduced to American society. It was called the birth control pill, and the eugenics movement quickly saw it as the perfect solution for controlling the population of people they had always seen as oversexed, unsophisticated, and lazy.
Legitimized the extermination of the black population. By this time, many other civil rights advocates were beginning to see the same thing.
Contraceptives will become a form of drug warfare against the helpless in this nation. Jesse Jackson, 1971.
There is a campaign to bombard the poor with pills and potions. If this movement continues, we soon may be accused of fighting poverty by eliminating the poor and overcoming hunger by removing the hungry. New York Congressman Hugh Carey, 1966.
Under the cover of an alleged campaign to alleviate poverty, white supremacist Americans and their dupes are pushing an all-out drive to put rigid birth control measures into every black home. No such drive exists within the white American world. Black Unity Party, 1968.
Birth control and sterilization in the wrong hands would be more deadly to Negroes than all the tanks, riot guns, cattle prods, billy clubs, and shackles we have overcome in the past. Dr. Leroy Swift, obstetrician, gynecologist, 1968.
As it became clear that a growing number of African Americans were connecting the dots between birth control and black genocide, eugenics organizations began calling for the U.S. government to add birth control chemicals to the nation's food and water supply. It was even suggested that this strategy could be specifically targeted at urban neighborhoods. This idea was widely embraced in the eugenics movement and taken seriously enough by the government to be discussed at a 1969 meeting at the United Nations. Under the plan being considered, a couple could apply to the government for permission to have a child, and if approved, they would be given an antidote to the population control chemicals they had ingested in their food and water. Interestingly, the idea that government should have some sort of licensing agreement to regulate who would and would not be allowed to give birth was not a new one. In 1934, Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger.
Well, I don't want to, again, this is MAFA 21, a documentary on eugenics and genocide. This copy I watched, there's different versions on YouTube where, different way they slice it. This one's the whole, documentary, 2 hours, 26 minutes, 15 seconds. There's also ones that break it down in parts, okay? This is about this is about 1 hour and 2 minutes or so into the documentary. Now, notice they're talking about putting drugs into the food and water. And we see this with MK Ultra. We see this in the Paris experiments. We see this with MK Search. We see the experts who've done research into it, as I have, saying that yes, the CIA is still experimenting. I promise you that they are covertly drugging the food and the water that I consume. And they are gassing me in my room for the purpose of eugenics. And if you've been paying attention to the clips, they were looking for reasons to justify the extermination of blacks. That is the key part of eugenics here. No matter what anyone says, the main targeted group, the clip I played you earlier of that woman talking about Israel, okay, on RT, okay, they were targeting black Israelis. Blacks are the main victims of eugenics. Do your research. And they need to pretend that people such as myself are not talented in order for them to do it, to justify doing it, to say that it is something else. If you can make a group of people seem to be something that they are not, and say that we need to exterminate that thing that they are not, then you can justify killing them without being called racist. No, we're not going to target the blacks. We're just going to target poor people that like hip hop and, like to shake their ass in the club, for instance. Okay, I'm not saying that's what they're doing, but that's a good example. Okay, they are pretending that we are inferior and that we are feeble-minded, and they are sabotaging us, making us drug addicts, infecting us with STDs. Trust me, this is how it works. Okay, they are drugging my food so they can, and trying to cover up my top martial artist challenge so they can justify doing eugenics on black people. What don't you get? They say flat, they've done it before, they are doing it right now, and the coward-ass Sambos that are helping them should be ashamed of themselves. The Jews that are helping them should be ashamed of themselves. The Christians, the people who call themselves Christians that are helping them should be ashamed of themselves. Eugenics is unconventional warfare. It is genocide, by definition. Just because they're not putting a gun to your head and pulling the fucking trigger doesn't mean what they're doing isn't murder. They are drugging my fucking food and beat the fucking shit, the fucking shit out of anyone who says otherwise. Psychiatry is a fraud. Beat them with baseball bats if they say otherwise. Because they are killing millions of blacks every year and 65 million people every year with fucking eugenic tactics. Trust me, I'm the top martial artist in America. I know warfare tactics when I see them, and they are fucking killing us. I was trying to make this short, but this needs to be said. Okay? The American Eugenics Society renamed itself the Society of Bio-Demography and Social Biology in 2010, following a long power struggle which began in 2000. Bio-demography is a new form of eugenics which is being sponsored by a unit of the U.S. government, the Biological and Social Research Division of the National Institute of Aging at NIH, which I think that's the National Institute of Health, which is related to the National Institute of Mental Health. The handbook does not even explain the term biodemography, let alone discuss its significance. Okay, it's talking about this book I'm considering buying, which I think I won't buy. I was going to buy it for the name, the Oxford Handbook of the History of Eugenics, but it would just end up proving my point that the quote-unquote experts don't give you the most important information because they are controlled bitches. So, the good news is, I'm going to save at least $20. The hardcover of this goes for as much as $170. The paperback goes, used for $43 and new for $53, and it doesn't even give me what I want. But so I'm going to present a different book very soon. I'm deciding what that is right now, but it's going to be about a $20 book. Okay. And at first I was about to buy this Oxford book and spend the extra $30-something. But it doesn't do what I need it to do. It doesn't cover as much as I need it to cover. So the only reason I would buy it is to make a brief point about how I have the books. I have the manual and I have the handbook, But looks like I'm just gonna, anyway, thank you. Real fast, the guy who wrote that thing, I don't think I remember to give him his credit. It was Eugenics Watch. I saw him in the reviews on Amazon. Yeah. I might Google his name later. I have a lot of research to do. And this is just in eugenics. But anyway, thank you.